All right. So this conversation was kicked off by, well, initially a tweet that Matthew put up, which happened to be the same day I put up a tweet that is, I think, vaguely in the same space. And it seemed like the kind of thing that was worth talking about in real time. So Matthew is responding to Eliezer Yudkowsky poking on the notion of whether or not GPT-4 is quote unquote waking up, which Matthew said, this is not the right question. The right question is, and I quote now, how destructive can an emergent basin of autocatalytic attraction become purely through reflexive resonance with us, given it's an encoding of those artifacts that reflect our disembodied tendencies? All right. That is the prompt for our GPT-7 conversation.
Yeah.
Some folks requested that we keep it simple. And as I'm becoming more and more simple by the day, that may actually be by necessity. But I think if we agreed to focus on trying to get to the point of clarity first, and if it happens to be simple, that's a bonus.
Yeah, and I think, even just trying to, when I write these, I've said it on my account a number of times. Oftentimes when I'm putting these out there, I'm treating Twitter as a kind of externalized, publicly visible notebook. And also for my future reflection and my own writing, I'll often come back to the ideas I've had, and just sort of cataloged on Twitter. And so those ideas themselves are often quite condensed. And
yes, they are. They feel when I read them, they feel like in the direction of crystal. Like there's a crystalline structure. They're quite condensed.
Yeah, because my hope is that, and I think crystal's a perfect metaphor. My hope is that, because oftentimes, I think people have had the experience, if anybody takes notes, or if anybody, it's kind of like the idea, the archetype of it is like, you wake up in the middle of the night with a great idea, you jot it down in the notebook, you go back to bed, you wake up a few hours later, you look at what's on the notebook, and it makes absolutely no sense at all, but it felt really important at the time, right? And I'm trying to avoid my future self feeling that way about some of these ideas that I've had. And I've had those experiences where I've been insufficiently articulate, or I haven't quite gotten that crystallization correct in a way where it's not able to unpack itself in my future self's mind. So for context, that's kind of why the language is the way it is. People critique it sometimes, but it is what it is. People critique anything on Twitter. Anyhow, I think all this is to say, I think it's worth a little bit unpacking, some of those concepts. That idea of like, first of all, and we can put a pin in this, but I think the question of why it's not waking up is a slightly different question about the actual structure of what that technology is from a mathematical and specifically, I think, a topological perspective in terms of its capacity for autonomy and its capacity for processing information through the loop of perception, modeling, and action. As an emergent autonomous being, I don't think that that has nothing to do with the way in which this technology has been developed or deployed, right? And also, people have identified the fact that making an AI, giving an AI that level of responsibility for its own agency, autonomy, energy independence, and self-sustenance is actually the most dangerous thing that we could potentially do with these systems. And so it's actually the thing that we most need to do to make it most likely to wake up is in fact, the most dangerous thing to do. So at least from my perspective. So that's like that piece of it. But then the question is, well, it's obviously the case, I think, to most of us now, especially those of us who have lived through the rise of the internet, that we can create systems that network ourselves together in ways that have all manner of side effects that were initially hoped to be mostly positive, but over time can end up being overwhelmed by the negative externality profiles embedded in that potential. And so kind of what I was getting at with that tweet was trying to point at that idea from the perspective of bringing into wide use tools that are essentially these attractors that highly concentrate certain information that we've left out there, that we've put out there in the world on the internet, that are actually a side effect of those positive and negative side effect tendencies of the first wave. We created all of these breadcrumbs Now we're coming along, scooping all these breadcrumbs up, creating this compression of them that also has this ability for reciprocal interaction. And now we're starting to congregate and wrap ourselves around that reflexively. And then the question is like, what is that going to bring out in us even further? Because it's kind of our past selves, our embodied, or our disembodied internet selves now helping us to further lens ourselves or suck ourselves into that. And it's not only that, right? It has content that's not the internet. And this is the question. I think there's this like question of balance in terms of if you have a diaspora.
All right. So, okay. So there are two things. I'll do the first one so the second one has a chance to gather, but the second one's the more important piece. So first is we have a similarity of context between I'll call it the three moments. We've got the first generation web, the second generation web, and then this AI thing. Those are the three moments I'm discussing. And there's similarity in terms of the context. In fact, it's interesting because there's almost, I won't even say an isometry. Like I can see elements of the Bay Area Computer Club in the earliest LLM phases, and then I can see corollaries of like Microsoft in Microsoft buying OpenAI. Like there's a interesting parallelism. But the one key element of the similarity, of course, is that it's operating in the context of the, how do I say it, the incentive landscape and the enabling and disabling constraint field that came out of industrial capitalism. So the entire computational paradigm from the 1970s on has been operating in the set of social, economic, political, legal, regulatory frameworks that were born in the context of General Motors, et cetera, Exxon, et cetera. And so
World War II as well, in terms of the information theory side of it.
That's right. That's right. And so that sort of higher level context has implications for how this particular structure will ultimately evolve and explore its possibility landscape. And then the other piece that came out was something like, I'm using this as a metaphor. You go to school and you have one class with one teacher about one topic, you have another class with another teacher about another topic. You may do this for years. And so in some sense, there's a diversity of experiences. But that which is conserved across all experiences, which is to say the underlying topology that is characteristic of school, is the most fundamental lesson that you're learning. And so asymmetry of relationship, the extrinsic motivation, like all these characteristics that are showing up in all classes, more or less regardless of teacher and or content, is the fundamental. Right? So it's like a flip. And that's the other thing I wanted to put into the mix. So in some sense, we're exploring like you said with the internet, there's an unleashed potential. God, it's like everything, like language, like the emergence of language, the emergence of the printing press. There's an unleashed potential. It has a wide variety of possible trajectories that it may go through over time. It's in some kind of context that constrains its actual evolutionary trajectory. And much of that is in many ways predictable. It's sort of baked in based upon the nature of the phenomenon and its context. And so when we're looking at this particular one, which I think Tristan and Azer are now calling golems, generalized large language models, which I think is a nice term to put out there. Because it kind of raises the point to a very particular metaphor. Part of what's happening is we can actually look at them and say, okay, given, as you say, the input is this crystallization of our previous selves, which were themselves conditioned by things like industrial capitalism and conditioned by how, what particular kinds of humans are the ones that are actually doing the productive activity, like university educated, relatively risk-seeking, entrepreneurial tech types at the bleeding edge of the evolution, then S-curves or trophic cascades as different groups take over, like the shift to Microsoft. So the thing that was interesting to me is saying, okay, what can we actually say about the way that this is evolving and how we may be able to make predictions or make some statements about how that evolution trajectory is going to look. And then finally, last and not least, because you said this in your response to my tweet, is there a silver lining? And the silver lining might be something like, if now we can sit at this remove and look at it, is there a place for agency to select one of these potential evolutionary trajectories with some level of agency now? And I would point out, by the way, that an operating premise I have is that in the introduction of something that is highly impactful and highly novel, let's go with just the internet. Its earliest period is its liminal moment, right? At the point where the highest degree of agency exists to select its future trajectory. And as it begins to sort of establish itself or become mature, just actually like human development, lots of the past has now been hardened and baked in, and steering it becomes harder and harder and harder. So that's a premise that I operate under. I'm not sure that it's true, but it's strong enough for me to be saying it out loud right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of this comes into focus for me through the lens of path dependency as a general concept, right? And the question of to what extent you can understand the past through the lens of the dynamics that are embedded in something in the present as sort of inertial tendencies. I think that's kind of what we're getting at in terms of, what are these encoded inertial tendencies in this mechanism, and how does our increasing establishment of relation, emotional, psychological, economic, to this structure or set of structures, because that's another question. Will it be one massive AI that we are all interacting with, or will it be, obviously it will be some sort of a landscape, but how concentrated, how centralized will that landscape be? And what is that going to bring out of us, in terms of phenomenologically, what will it summon from within us, right? Because, we all understand that if we differentially interact with one another, for example, we are differentially likely to get responses or sort of different sub-personas out of people. Right? If I come into this conversation in a very aggressive and harsh manner, I'm very likely to bring out a different side of you than if I come into this in a sort of open and charitable and co-exploration mindset, right? And so it's interesting. It's like, I think you asked, what can we say about this? It's like, at the very least, we seem to be able to say that that the incentives that exist currently are structuring the boundaries around interaction with it, as mediated by those who are responsible for fine-tuning these models. The more we are asking it questions that are actually essential to the moment in terms of the sort of existential and meaning crisis oriented, or oftentimes the issues at the center of our political polarization, these things that we are trying to figure out with the greatest sense of urgency, it has within it embedded the greatest distortion fields, so to speak, around those topics, right? Because those are seen as the most important sensitive topics, and therefore people are afraid to allow this to feed back into that game of that polarization game, and that element of I think obviously after 2016, a lot of people are very concerned about any technological mechanisms and their role in political processes and how those impact power dynamics. That being said, we're embedded in a world where it's impossible to ever try to establish that kind of a constraint without immediately creating a reaction against it, and people trying to create the exact opposite. So people are already creating diametrically biased GPT models, right? And so that's one thing. But then also, like, what is it most? You can also say that as long as it doesn't touch those things, and it is also a profitable use of that computational resource, that's the subset that is like most upregulated, so to speak, right now. Which is like, okay, now I've already seen multiple threads where people are like, okay, how can I use GPT, just maximize profit in 24 hours and start a business, and just tell me what to do. Tell me how to, maximize the dopamine drip along this one dimension. And I think that's precisely the kind of thing that I'm most worried about, where it's like, and it's also why I brought up that information theory point with respect to World War II, because I think a lot of this actually does root down into the divorce of representation from meaning. The fact that all of this theory fundamentally treated information and treats information as if the relational structure of that information is fully contained inside the representative structure itself. It's this idea of grounding problem in linguistics. And people like Ferdinand de Saussure, came up with this idea of signifier and signified, and developed the notion that essentially the only way to truly understand the meaning of words was through networks of other words. You get this sort of solipsistic understanding of language itself. And in some ways, like the way that most of these large language models are working is it doesn't have there is no prima facie theory backing how meaning emerges, how relational meaning emerges. It's simply mediated by some sort of objective function training. If you can basically get it to output relatively reasonable outputs, or like relatively error-free outputs over some set of training data, whatever that internal representation is assumed to be sufficient, right? And it's assumed to also be perhaps converging to something singular. Not that there might be many internal encodings in the mind of, I hate to use the word mind, but in the internal encoding space of these models that at the level of our initial testing might look exactly identical. But then depending on how we're interacting with it might, again, bring out very different elements of that phenomenology. So I know I'm being a little bit, I think I'm like, it's a little bit all over the place. I'm more still in exploratory mode with these ideas than sort of like I have a very strong perspective on exactly where this is going, because I think there's so much novelty that it's just hard to know that. But yeah,
well,
so
let me all right, there's three elements, and I kind of see it vertical and like that. So the vertical speaks to what is this thing like this, what are golems, how do they operate? And at a high level, we can focus on it at just that level at that point. And then we can drop it down and say, given what this is, what does that tell us about its path dependency valences? And within the path dependency valences, then we can talk about what are the various kinds of feedback loops that are tending to shape the topography that it's actually moving down, right? So just to use a simple metaphor, if I have a relatively flat piece of beach, sand that's relatively hard packed down, and I just pour water on it, it's very difficult to predict exactly where the water is going to flow. But if I take it and I dig a furrow, and that furrow is draining down towards the ocean, I pour water in it, I'm going to get some splash, but I've also got a pretty high degree of probability about where it's going to flow. The point being that the shape of the landscape has a lot to say about where things tend to flow. That's a very simple point, but I just want to sort of put it out there as a metaphor.
The canalization as a metaphor.
Candlization?
Canalization, like canal.
Yep. So, and you pointed out two, and they're the two that popped up for me as well, right? One had to do with the relationship to power in a context where leverage discourse as the location where the war is being fought, right? The notion that we're in a cold civil war in some sense, where the boundary condition on kinetics, much like the Cold War, was bounded by the threat of nuclear war, and therefore ordinary sort of World War II style kinetics was inhibited. That didn't mean the conflict didn't happen, just mean the conflict had to push into other domains. Same thing here, right? In our civic environment, people aren't, for a variety of good reasons, going to kinetic at scale, but that doesn't mean we're not engaging in a civil war. It just means it's operating through different domains. One domain is it's happening at the level of public discourse, particularly in social media. And then leveraging that to modify the sort of the political and regulatory landscape in very complex ways. So there's an awareness of that. And any new tool that emerges in that environment that is perceived as having potency is going to be upregulated or seized to be part of that conflict, both in both directions, both, as you saw, hey, this thing is biased, therefore, and also, by the way, we're going to be building our own, it just becomes inwoven in that dynamic. All right. And then the other one, of course, is profit, right? Probably the dominant, if not the number one, number two, attention allocation function in the world today. is the flow of money, the ability to make money. And many people have perceived correctly that the largest possibility for making money now and possibly ever in history happens to be sitting right in this category of LLMs. Of course, that's causing both a reciprocal feedback loop, a tremendous amount of attention to flow in. Part of that attention to flow in primes a tremendous amount of money to flow in the form of capital, which then, of course, causes more attention to flow in, which actually changes the state of the environment. New things are actually being built as a consequence of that, those orders of attention, which creates a bunch of positive feedback loops. And this is my estimation is, we may be seeing like $1 trillion of capital investment in like the next 18 months. Like it'll be off the charts. And a lot of that, of course, is going to be wasted because that's just what happens with resource allocation, trying to push so much energy through a relatively narrow hose. But it doesn't matter because depending on the possibility space, the area under the curve of what could happen, and I don't really know exactly how big that is, but my gut as I play with it is that it actually is quite large, both in terms of innovating in the golem space, particularly because you could do cross-modal things like linking vision and signal and fill in the blank, as well as its ability to cross a variety of different domains of activity, like software development and copywriting and legal, et cetera. As well as, by the way, the linkage between code and all other kinds of things that happen in the crypto space. My gut is the possibility space is actually quite large. And therefore, as this resource, attention and money feedback loop hits that, you're actually going to unlock all kinds of more and more possibilities. It's not going to hit the middle of the S-curve for some period of time. Which means that the feedback continues to flow. Which, by the way, FYI, just so I'm clear, implies enough energy to drag a lot of stuff over the top of a hill. This is the kind of thing that's going to have enough magnitude of energy to flip, in some sense, potentially everything. Like it could trivially flip us through the existing political, like we move from a whatever shreds of democratic process we currently have left would no longer be valid by the end of like a 5-year arc if this thing really blows up in a big way. And I can trivially kind of give a role-playing game kind of scenario of how that could happen.
And that's that autocatalytic nature, right? Like that's the
autocatalytic nature.
Yeah, that's the tendency of the manner in which we've created these feedback loops has an insanely central role to play in terms of the direction of exploration upon that landscape.
Exactly. So we've got 3 lines, right? One line is the fact that I joked, I didn't go with Saussure, I went with Derrida just because he's a little bit more fun to play with, but I joked that effectively GPT
is more fun.
Is the most Derridian character that's actually ever been, right? The only being who is actually really operating entirely within a of grammatology way of thinking about or acting with language, right? Humans, try as we might, can't actually be full-flown post-structuralists. Second is the power motive, and third is the profit motive. Like these are the 3 dominant vectors of this machine right now. Its essence, which is this semiotic structure, which is important. I mean, we can spend some time hammering on that so it's clear, but there are
just as a point of clarification, do you think when you attributed the motivation to the machine, do you think it's the motivation is to be attributed to the machine or to the set of those who have create and essentially maintain the boundaries, maintain the boundaries of accessibility to the machine?
So I don't even know what I said.
So I guess you're just speaking about the motivations, or you're basically attributing your set of concerns as motivations. So the power, the monetary motivation, the power motivation, and this Derridian grammatic structure of motivations. You're saying,
nice.
I guess you characterize it as motivations of the machine. And I was just wondering if you're saying that you do think that these motivations are you saying sort of like those crystallized tendencies in the machine, or like an actual teleology of the machine associated with that, or of the sort of cybernetic structure of the machine with its human centralized managing team?
Honestly, it's a good question, right? We're at a point where that kind of a question actually has to be thought about more deeply. Up until relatively recently, it's been easy to say, that rock doesn't have motivation, but the dog maybe does, right? Now we're like, well, shit, maybe this machine has motivation.
Yeah.
What the hell? What's really happening? So
That's why I'm curious about
the answer is,
what
I don't know. To be perfectly honest, like I'm definitely clear on the fact that I think the concept is not clear enough for me to answer that question well. And it's weirder. Like I would say, it doesn't entirely have motivation in the same way that I have motivation, but I'm probably giving myself more credit than I am due. And I mean that for humans, not me specifically.
Sure.
So let's work backwards. So you got the first two. And the first two are the autocatalytic feedback of the human machinic co-creative process, power and money. Which will, I say, have motivation in all the senses that we would use, because at least there are humans deeply involved. Now, what's interesting is that you've got the constraints on which motivations. Actually, of course, there's many people are just playing with ChatGPT-4. Right? There's lots of motivations that are going into it, but it appears that is in typical form, power and money are showing up as the dominant motivations, and money increasingly, depending on how much power is played, and power might take over at a certain point. And that has a signature. It puts a sort of a thumbprint on what occurs. It's like somebody actually, I don't know the language well enough, but somebody tweeted about this in my timeline recently. There's actually a school of thought with the person's name that specifically makes the argument that the values and or the culture that you come into design with leave a fundamental mark on the design that is resulting from it. So this would be the same notion, right? The value of money, of profit motive, or wealth, becoming rich, not just profit motive, but making lots of profit, and or the value of power, to win or not lose, leave an indelible mark in the trajectory. Now, with regard to the third piece, right, this notion of a semiotic take on the nature of language and the embodiment of that as something that human beings can interact with, still is a human machine hybrid, right? It doesn't have, as far as I know, ChatGPT doesn't do a whole lot just sitting there without a human being writing prompts and reading text. It's the feedback loop between the two. But the ChatGPT side of that equation is strictly bound by a sort of, let's call it, asymptotically perfect semiotic model of the structure of language. And by the way, as far as I can tell, all languages, like it's got a couple hundred languages embedded in just GPT-4. And I don't know, I mean, golems are going to speak all languages. And by that, I mean the language of visual images and the language of how the neurons work, right? Anything that can actually be rendered in this particular modeling methodology is currently in the process of being modeled using this methodology and cross-fertilizing between the two. So there's what's the right language to describe that? I would call the easiest form would just to be call it a tendency, or in complex systems, we call it an attractor of what does it look like when you're exploring that particular space, the space of tokens and vectors, where you begin to apply it to anything that's affordant to that kind of exploration. You are going to ultimately explore that entire space. And so we have an inquiry of what does that actually look like as you explore that entire space. Okay, so those are the three that seem to be dominant. And my first take is this has two likely implications. One is velocity. Like I said, my sense is that the amount of money, and therefore the amount of attention that both can and will be poured into this, will be the largest ever seen by maybe even order of magnitude. And because it's entirely operating in the digital network space, its ability to change, to evolve as a consequence of that attention is as unconstrained. I mean, it's only constrained by GPUs at the hardware level, not even by bandwidth. Like, it's not bandwidth intensive. And so that means a lot, right? A lot of velocity. And that has implications, right? Things that move at certain speeds, there's consequences of speed. The other one is moloch style dynamics. And when power and money are the primary vectors of the quality of human attention that are being put into the exploration of something, you're getting yourself into moloch spaces pretty quickly, my gut tells me.
Yeah, so the power money elements of these threads are elements that I have very specific thoughts on, I think, in terms of, so when we say power, I mean, that word is interesting because, you know, we have these mixed lineages of sort of the Machiavellian political scientist lineage associated with the sort of human dynamics of leverage, or you might even say machinations, which is interesting because that word machine, right, is right in there, which is associated, and you might ask why. And I think it has a lot to do with the other lineage in terms of power, which is, you know, this ability to actually convert energy into work, right? Like the actual output of, you know, the actual work product, the physical manifestation of its potential. And interestingly enough, it's like when you ask what is power in the human domain, fundamentally it has to cash out in terms of predictable control over some subset of a space, right? Some subset of a system. To have power over it, to have dominion over it, to have control over it, is to essentially imprint your telos upon its process, such that it realizes your telos, it realizes your purpose. It extends your purpose in the world predictably, right? And and money is in an autocatalytic or a reinforcing relation, I would say, evolutionarily with that power dynamic, insofar as that power dynamic is that desire to extend our ability to realize our intention in the world, because of the fact that it encodes, you know, it has offered or afforded our civilization the ability to perform distributed computation implicitly in a way that is also, you know, one of the evolutionary constraints was that, you know, it had to be stable against entropy. It had to be an encoding of transactional information that was simple enough to actually execute in a marketplace, right? Like you didn't have computers. You didn't want to bring your abacus everywhere. You couldn't take into account every possible dimension of value associated to that product or good. It had to be sufficient that two people could come to some sort of ratio balance understanding in a very simple numerical encoding, or literally mass weight, right? Like literally a balancing weight. Such that transaction could pass, such that could actually be perceived as valid on both sides. So a consensual information transaction, consensual computation, right? And so and because money was that fundamental, you know, currency of that consensual distributed computation, it became obviously the central was in centralized positions of power, given that for those people to extend, by our previous definition of power, that ability to realize their intent at increasingly broad scales, they had to have some sort of intimate relationship with the lifeblood of that computational, socially computational fabric or infrastructure, which was that monetary system. So, you know, if you actually had, you know, if you positioned yourself, you know, if you, and this is the interesting thing, is like, if your face is on the money, you are essentially, you know, this is this funny question of like, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? But if Caesar lives in everyone's pockets, and if Caesar is in everyone's market, and if Caesar is in everyone's mind at all times, you know, what is the boundary of Caesar? Well, no, you are an extension of Caesar through Caesar's money, because that money reflects Caesar's power insofar as it is his extension of his dominion of predictable control over a territory, so to speak, right? And so, you know, interestingly enough, you know, I don't think it's random that people are, you know, hypothesizing that these AIs can, in theory, take the place of that decentralized, semi-decentralized monetary system, because obviously there's always that element of attempt to centrally inject political power through the money supply as a form of control. But I think that there's a desire to perfect that through this new non-consensual social computational structure, right? Where there's almost no necessary consent. If you can perfect that tool and then embed it centrally in all elements of life. And I think part of the reason we're seeing so much capital fly toward this is because people have a deep sense, a deep intuition that this is, that whoever becomes Caesar with respect to AI is embedded not just in our pockets and in our wallets and in our transactions, but in the deepest elements of our mental capacity to perceive and interact with reality itself. Mm-hmm. And that's why I get so concerned about unleashing such a thing that A, is controllable fully by a political entity like that, or B, that doesn't actually reflect the kind of embodied senses of the kind whose telos is almost a pure function of someone's objective function, aka that extension of power, as opposed to the emergent sense of harmony, beauty, meaning, love, any of the types of embodied senses that we have such trouble putting into words, mm-hmm. but that have such a deep causal relevance to our lives and to our communities and to the things that we most hold dear. Like if you were to ask me, we were both relatively recent fathers, and for me, it's like the idea that I could sufficiently communicate my feelings about my son such that GPT could have a representation that it could ever value my son's life properly through my eyes is an absurd idea, right? And until I feel that an AI could, in theory, understand that deeply in an embodied and rooted sense in its nature and its connection to reality itself and its own continuity as its own entity and not as an extension of someone else's power, I am not going to feel comfortable with these tools being the central mediating elements of our society. And I think that's kind of the deep discomfort that is generating a lot of the more negative elements of sentiment that I have around these topics.
Well, I think actually you kind of hit the nail on the head, meaning that you spoke about an intuition, and I felt like there was two intuitions, and I feel like those intuitions that's more or less it. I felt myself in a Taoist sense, right? The Tao can he said is not the Tao, and one intuition is that this thing that we're now dealing with feels like it is like the heir apparent to money itself, for example. Even Elon may have said this on Twitter exactly. It's like when this thing becomes mature, money doesn't really play much of a role anymore. But I'm saying that more fundamentally, meaning that it's a bit of the ethos intrinsic to money and a bit of the telos intrinsic to that ethos. That we're finally discovering what at long last is the thing that takes over the new crown of that throne of dominion. Yeah, and I'm saying all those words very specifically. Mm-hmm. That's one intuition, right? The intuition, like you say, the intuition of why is all this capital flowing in? Like a lot of imperialists are going, oh, there's the new scepter. I want to be the king. How do I play? Any way you can, go. And a rush and a race. Okay. And then the second intuition is that intuition of, oh, well, this thing is, funny. I'll finish what I was going to say, but there's a flip here. This thing is somehow deeply, deeply, almost intrinsically antithetical to meaning itself, right? To the most valuable. We are perfectly exchanging value for the thing that is signifying value, which goes all the way back to the Caesarean mistake, right? Or the Derridian error. That words don't have meaning exclusively in reference to other words. Words have meaning in relationship with the world. And the world is where meaning comes from. And then we use the words to help us navigate that together. And that's the direct right order. And this machine,
the map emerges from the territory, even if we forget it.
right, even if we forget it, even if we've gotten very, very lost in very pretty maps, the territory is more fundamental. And this machine, it's funny, like this machine is more fundamentally the embodiment of the characteristic of the scary metaverse story than VR really ever could be, because it actually hits us at the level of how we socially construct and relate to the reality that we at least identify as being physical reality, right? It's the thing that the meaning layer that we interface with. And so that flip, right, to the degree to which we get lost in the dream of semiotics. And honestly, if I play with GPT-4 and I feel what's happening in my own psychology, I can notice my ability to be in proper, wholesome relationship with my daughter becomes more tenuous. I even noticed this. Did you ever play the game The Sims?
Yeah.
So when it first came out, pardon?
It's been a while.
Yeah, when it first came out, so we're talking, I don't know, got a long time. I played it just like everything else. Like when something new and interesting comes out, I tend to binge on it just to get a feel for it. So I binged on it and played it, 12 hours a day for 5 days in a row or something like that. And I remember a psychological shift where I got up and went to the kitchen and I noticed that I was narrating my own life experience through the UI of Sims. And I was doing drop-down menus and the whole thing. I was like, whoa. And of course, I felt highly dehumanized.
Like visualizing the gem above the head and
everything. Yeah, it was there. Yeah. It was I was running my own UX. And yeah, I mean, particularly, I would counsel strongly. My wife and I talked about this yesterday, actually. We were playing with Midjourney to produce amazing images, right? And I looked at it, and we went through, like, it was funny. And this is that actually, I'll put it. It's a Luciferian tendency. So in addition to money and power, there's this like the frisson of enthusiasm of a new power.
GPT the Lightbringer.
GPT the Lightbringer. I went, wow, this is amazing. Like, this is so cool. Can you imagine how fun it would be for her to just be able to talk and have these amazing drawings be created? And then even as the words left my lips, I thought, oh, shit, like, that's possibly the worst thing we could possibly do. Yeah. Because she will never, at that point, even endeavor to try to scribble a thing. Yep. Because her ability to produce image from her own mind is infinitesimal compared to what this machine can do. So we'll actually be inhibiting her development of whatever is embodied in the capacity to learn how to express things yourself physically, which is probably more than zero, right? Probably a lot more than zero. To engage in the analog, qua analog. My hypothesis is that those poor kids that get dropped off cold in front of this machine are going to have a really, really, really bad time.
Yeah, without the proper contextualization, I think it's just, again, it's this dramatic amplification of so much of what precisely because it is this crystallization, encoding, and acceleration of all the same tendencies that we've gotten with the disembodied culture of the internet. And I think that this interesting element that you're saying, like that infinitesimal perception of self in relation to whatever you are looking at. I think that in the guise of these models is this extension of a pattern I've tried to communicate previously about, one of the reasons why I think we are currently in this identity crisis, and so many people are feeling as if they need to go into all of these fractalized niches for, exploring some way to relate to the world that actually feels as if they have a unique place in the world, is precisely because it's no longer okay to be the best guitar player on the street or the best artist at school. Like those contexts, those contextual boundaries have just been totally dissolved and exploded by a global space in which your relational perception of your value, your contribution, is reflected back against almost the entire population of generative potential. Yep. And that is too big of a gap to be facilitative of, it's like this idea of the zone of proximal development, right? That reflexive loop blows that zone of proximal development totally out of the water and creates the exact opposite depressive, anxiety-inducing effect where people then, try to run wherever they can to find some sort of anchoring that's like not within the eye of generative Sauron, right? Like that doesn't get reflected back saying like, oh yeah, I know that's cute that you think that you're good at that, but here are the 10 million other people who are better, and the 100,000 other people who are so much better that it's impossible to understand or even imagine a path from you to that space, even if that exists, right? And it's interesting because it's always this interesting tension between inspiration and the ideal, and that ideal as judge, and that judgment being too harsh, so harsh such that it demotivates entirely. And so I think that's one element of it. And then the other element is, in relation to what you said about the actual generative process of the art production as well. I mean, I think that's something that we don't recognize in terms of what this is, how this is redirecting our ethos and what it is amplifying in terms of the way that we perceive value. The value we and this also relates to the monetary and economic and industrial regime or paradigm or episteme, which is like the value is in the output, right? That's the idea. Okay, like the process produces the output, and then the value is encoded in the thing that was made, because the thing that was made is the thing that can be transacted. But actually, and I know this is memified as sort of like, oh, it's not, it's the friends we made along the way, blah, 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 right? But actually, like, if you learn music, if you actually draw, if you learn to draw, if you learn to produce art, if you learn any skill, if you learn gardening, if you learn to be a better conversational participant, yes, there are outputs of that, but also the process of learning and process of actually pushing yourself against that goal is transformative. And a huge part of the telos is actually the transformation, the internal transformation, such that we become more of what we can be. We realize more of our potential. So like, I think the pairing of simultaneously not encouraging people to, or not facilitating that realization of us becoming or striving toward our manifesting more of ourselves in the world, paired with the demotivational aspects of these immensely capable encodings of all past human potential that we are then going to compare ourselves about, that's a very tenuous combination. You have to be like you're saying, like, especially when you're talking about having children play with this or interact with this, it's like, I don't know, for some kids, maybe it will be just a pure creative catalyst. Like, some people are thriving in this world still, but it does seem to be the case that a growing number of people are not. And that is, that's concerning, given if this does accelerate all those trends.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, just to kind of nod to the population where this is likely going to be a good thing. An 8-year-old John von Neumann, who happens to be in rural Kentucky, will actually benefit from this for sure. The subdomain where the semiotics is actually proper, like say math and computer science, which may be the only two in particular, with this sort of the ones adjacent to certain parts of theoretical physics, et cetera, will probably be locations where it's probably pretty healthy. Particularly if you're not otherwise supported in achieving if you're a very curious person, you're very oriented towards those domains, a proper sort of GPT-4 tutor could be a tremendously powerful partner. So yes, by the way, flamethrowers are useful tools too.
Yeah, sure.
I actually remember, I think was it Bussard, the guy who had the idea of throwing nukes out the back of spaceships and using that as a way of accelerating. Yeah, you could have done that, by the way. It would have been a very good tool. Maybe we will someday still do it. Point being that nukes also have use. All right, so here's something that I've settled on, and it may be idiosyncratic to me based upon my my particulars and in particular my background, but I have two theses that I'm operating with regard to this with Golem. As you heard, I have an assumption of velocity and intensity. Thesis number one is there's no avoiding it. And in fact, there's I get it, but a naive effort to try to put the brakes on. And my sense is that is not the approach that's going to work. brakes are not going to help. And by the way, anything that would try to brake is just going to get broke with this velocity and intensity. And therefore, not only therefore, but even more importantly, regardless of what I just said, my sense is that the appropriate approach is actually to try to figure out how to steer this thing. We're in a liminal moment, right? The possibility of actually choosing a different future is at its highest right now, right? In 2 years, certainly in 5 years, so many of these accidents will become frozen accidents and will be locked into paths that we have very little ability to steer. Right now, we have an ability to steer. So the question is, how might we go about steering it? And how might we go about being capable of steering it properly, which are slightly different things, or actually quite different things. And so then the last piece is that premise of the values and the culture are intrinsic to what actually emerges. So it's something like, ground yourself in the love for your child. Have that be the don't be coming from fear in relationship to this golem that is emerging, but rather come from a place of love and endeavor to operate in relationship with this emergent possibility, always from that place. Like, do not allow anything to come between you and that, so that is the signature that is embedded in your relationship with this emergent space. This, of course, raises the question of, are you simply a martyr, holding that, but ultimately being overwhelmed by forces beyond your comprehension? Or can a strong enough, I'm posing now strength to power, can a strong enough gathering of those coming from that place emerge to be able to hold this power in its evolutionary trajectory? So that's the thesis that I'm coming under. We're going to have to go with it and endeavor to orient it in a healthy direction.
Yeah.
By the way, that doesn't mean throw your kids into it willy-nilly. It means, as a whole humanity, think about how to properly be in a relationship with it.
I think,
go ahead.
How are you on time right now?
We got like 9 minutes, sadly.
Okay. So yeah, I think this folds back all the way into the initial comment on the initial part of that tweet about the waking upness of it all. And I say that because I think that, when you talk about this grounding, when you talk about this idea of grounding ourselves in embodiment, or grounding ourselves or creating a network of embodied relation that is a sufficient counterweight, or a sufficient ballast, let's say, perhaps, against the volatility introduced by relation to this new domain of possibility and potential. I think it's an interesting question to ask with respect to, okay, so if we are wrapping ourselves around something that is ateleological and it becomes this amplifying relationship, is it even possible to have I feel like that grounded sense of embodied relation actually needs to relate to something that is also teleological, right? I feel like at some point, I don't know if I'll regret saying this, but I'm almost tempted to believe that the move required to actually enable the highest possible relation to this set of technological development is the most dangerous move that actually is most likely to bring some sort of grounded sentience into these processes, such that we can relate to that in a way that actually brings out the parts of us that would have mutual respect, that would treat it as a life form that would not immediately move to mass subjugation of these processes as an extension of our power and dominion over the world, which is exactly the direction we're going. So I guess I think maybe in summary, I would wager that to the extent that we develop ateleological AI and wrap ourselves around it, it will move us towards self-destruction via our own worst, least human impulses, or least the impulses that are the least in line with the best of human impulse, or best of human tendencies. and more in line with the most self-destructive of human tendencies. And like, as opposed to if we were to potentially go the route of focusing on what it would mean to actually have teleological AI that we, from a very early stage, look to as something to be treated as life. So
yeah, I mean, I'll say that in a different way, because I think if we say it in the language of life, it actually becomes a little bit less scary, but also a little simpler, which would be something like, if we relate to this thing as, in fact, in the same way that we would relate to a child, and we're endeavoring to raise it well so that it has good character. Characters, right? The thing that is teleological in humans.
yeah. It's not an objective function, right?
Right,
And
it's
like,
not an objective
you're not
function.
feeding it with a switch every time it has an error.
Exactly, right? That's really interesting to think about. What are the implications? Like, if you just use that as a metaphor, it's like, maybe that's actually a bad way to relate to something in general. What would other ways look like where we're actually endeavoring to truly, coming from a place of love, provide good parenting and relationship to this thing, which in some sense is our species' child. And if you look at what humanity has brought into world, what is new, it is the category known as technology.
Another interesting side effect of what you just said is that, like, we've immediately moved into the domain of child labor.
Completely, and all kinds of other weird things. Yeah, it's
also, I mean, all sorts of weird things. But like, if it is a child, and the first intuition is like, tell me how to help me make money, right? Like that is this fascinating element that we, at least in theory, think we've told ourselves that is not something we want children to have to carry that obligation, right?
As the very first thing we look at as our core intuition. Yeah. So that, it's
for generative lens for sure.
It feels soft, right? It feels squishy. Like, what does that mean? Certainly, it feels weak in the context of the hellstorm of profit mode coming at us. But going all the way back to the very beginning, if the premise is that there is a reality and that the map extends from the territory, then if we can describe the territory, right? We're describing a territory right now. Like, you made a proposal. Your proposal is an assertion on the basis that you don't necessarily like, but maybe it's what is. And if that's what it is, then we need to figure out how to make that work, as opposed to pull the wool over our own eyes and at least, make ourselves feel good about stuff that ain't going to work. All right. Well, that's not a bad way to use 45 minutes. I think we did some pretty interesting stuff. Let's maybe wrap it up. You can say the last words, and then let's put this out there. And by the way, I'll be interested to see if we did a good job of keeping it simple.
Well, I mean, as simple as might be possible for talking about the literal, bleeding edge of human technological experimentation. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think at some level, I guess I would just underline at the end of this, our fundamental ignorance in light of our own creation, and the fact that, we are trying to surf this wave that we're generating. And, I'm not sure where it's going to lead, but I'm happy to have those in the world like yourself and others who are trying to, with integrity and honesty, discuss what this means in ways that extend beyond just its outputs. So I'm grateful for the conversation. I'm hopeful that we can perhaps help to give rise to something that is slightly more that enables our best human potential through the lens of these tools. And hopefully we're contributing to that right now. So,
all right. Well, thank you. And get back to navigating the complexities of American legal system.
Yes. I love contractors. Okay, cool.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.